Well, we are a very small, there's about 8 of us, and we're a privately funded nonprofit organization. Broadly speaking, what we do is we look for new and more effective ways for both the private and the public sector to work together. We kind of often say that we work at the intersection of the public and private sectors because we believe there's great opportunity for those partners to work together. The government alone cannot sustain all of the current government-funded programs and services out there, and they most certainly, even from an expertise standpoint, can't address all the social issues and concerns that we have right now. So we think it's extremely important that some of these unique partners come together to address some of those issues. And in bringing the partners together, what we do is hope to look for win-win solutions. So you've got the government that's benefiting, the nonprofit organization that may be one of the partners, it may be employers that you're working with, it could be the public education system, but it's really addressing those societal issues that we have and saying how can we all collaborate together to address this. Our tactics and our mission have kind of evolved over time, but most of the work we do centers around access to employment for people that have barriers. In the earlier years, so we've been around for about 13 or 14 years, in the earlier years we very much focused on venture philanthropy. So we were providing funding to individuals that were looking at building social enterprises. And maybe what I can do is give you a few examples. You may recognize some of them. But what we did was provide the seed money or the financing, but also then got actively engaged in the startup of their operations and provided a lot of advisory services. In Toronto here locally, there's Turnaround Couriers. And Turnaround Couriers, gosh, they've been in business for probably 8 to 10 years. They hire at-risk youth. So what they do is they work with a lot of the nonprofit organizations to say, we're providing opportunity both from a training and an employment perspective for youth that have had various areas of challenge. So it could be those that have had mental health issues, addictions. There may be some that there's been a criminal activity in the past, anything that's now creating a bit of a stopgap or a barrier to them finding employment. You can see them biking around the downtown core on a regular basis. They have quite a delivery service going, and they're now even doing the food delivery as well, which is pretty popular in the downtown core. The interesting thing about that nonprofit organization is that right from the beginning they were looking at how can we be financially sustainable, so they obviously have quite a detailed budget and cost analysis piece that is just a continual point of review and growth for them. And I'll get into that maybe a little bit later from a point of how that's a necessary kind of evil of social enterprises, is always working towards being self-sustainable. Another one that we helped fund as well was Inner City Renovations. It's in Winnipeg, and it employs urban Aboriginals. So still running to this day, and it's a viable and profitable business as well. In Quebec, we worked with Renaissance, which is very similar to the Goodwill model, from a point of retail stores that provide obviously secondhand clothing and goods and sell at a profit, and then roll those profits back in to provide training for individuals that have had barriers to employment. So it's almost like a on-the-job training because they actually work in the retail locations. The other one we worked with employs people that are women particularly that are victims of violence, and it's called Atira Property Management. It's in Vancouver and very relevant in today's market from a point of training because they do the renovation and constructions of government-funded buildings, so public housing and whatnot. So you've got individuals that are learning very marketable skills in today's labor market, as well as having access to affordable housing, because it in itself can be a barrier to employment for people. So what we also do as well is we look at models and how we can scale those models. So we looked at the success of those social enterprises and said, what can we do to scale the supports we've provided beyond just the financial piece? Because while it was great working with those businesses, we spent a lot of time getting them up to speed. Starting your own social enterprise is an extremely difficult task, so it's not for the faint-hearted, but able to reap so many rewards when it does get up and running. But what we wanted to do was take it to scale. So we decided that rather than providing the seed money, we would provide financial support to individuals that were buying franchises, because franchises offers what is a cookie cutter model. We wouldn't have to spend a lot of time helping them get the operations up and going, but we could offer the financial support that really, when you're starting any kind of business, is really your key concern or challenge, is raising those funds. So what we did for a number of years was we had a unique model where we provided financing to those buying franchises, with each person that they hired through a non-profit agency or a community support agency, we would lower their interest rate. So the incentive was for them to work with not-for-profit organizations and community agencies, which then would provide access to employment for people that had barriers to employment. That's with the assumption that if you're having a tough time finding work, you're potentially reaching out to the services of a not-for-profit agency. So that was the thinking behind that one. So over the course of the years, we provided loans to over 80 businesses. I think we had just shy of 500 people hired. So we said, okay, well, this is good, but how do we get bigger numbers? So we've now taken that model and we have something called Rate Drop Rebate, which is a program where we're working with the large financial institutions, a number of the large financial institutions, as well as credit unions, and they're offering this up as a product offering. So if you walk into one of their local branches, there's your traditional loan, and then there's a loan through Rate Drop Rebate, which again introduces you to not-for-profits and the community agencies by saying, you have a loan with us the next time you hire. If you hire someone through a community agency, you'll get an interest rate reduction on your loan, or they've opened it up now where people can get 6 months interest free on their credit lines as well. So it's really a social finance tool that we're trying to introduce to the market. So that just gives you a bit of a brief overview of what Social Capital Partners is all about. Say, well, whenever you're working with partners, in order to bring partners together, you need to sell to them your idea or what you want to do. So you need to develop a value proposition for each of those partners. And I would say that one of the greatest challenges for us, but I also know in working very closely with a lot of not-for-profits that it's an issue for them as well, is when you're looking at doing something differently or looking at new ways of tackling a problem. And we hear all the creative words of innovation and being disruptive and all these things within the not-for-profit sector. But I think when you're looking at doing anything in a new way, you're always working or what are the confines of the current funding that you have. Nonprofits rely heavily on both government and foundational funding. And with that funding comes rules and regulations, expectations and requirements on how you're going to use that funding. So it's very difficult sometimes when we're going to engage partners and selling to them what we want to do, and them trying to fit that in within the box of how they're expected to work right now. It's not that there isn't lack of passion or interest and people really wanting to jump on board with new things. It's how they can do it within their current kind of funding structures. So I think that if you look at funding now, it's really provided on a very much a quantitative basis. It's all about outcomes. We're going to give you this much money, and the expectation is you're going to find this many people jobs. there's very little focus on impact and the qualitative side of things, of what works and what doesn't. And, you know, if we tweak this, can we see better results here? Organizations, particularly not-for-profits, are very focused on outcomes and hitting numbers. So it's difficult and challenging to engage them to work differently. I think the government itself as well is a huge challenge. There's many layers, many players. There's probably 6, 8, 10 different ministries that work within the employment and training piece alone. So you can imagine from a point of nonprofits like ourselves trying to navigate that system and figure out, you know, who are the partners we should be working for or working with. So I'd say that's probably some of the biggest concerns we've had or challenges.
Great.
Well, I think the social enterprise is a business that makes both money and has social impact. So I think core to a social enterprise is they're starting with their cause, you know, or what impact they want to have on society. But knowing that in order to do that, they've got to have a good, solid business, you know, behind it. So the primary reason of their existence is to have the social impact. You know, that's what guides and directs them. But really the enterprise side of it is that it's a viable business, you know, and it can sustain itself. So while return on investment is required, you can't survive if you don't have one. It's the SROI, or the social return on investment, that really keeps these people you know, charged and excited about what they're doing. I think that, you know, when you're looking at social enterprise, the biggest thing is, you know, figuring out those alternate sources of funding, because it's not going to probably be financially viable from day one. So much time and attention initially on, okay, we've got this bucket of money to start, and it's most likely foundation or government money, maybe angel funding as well. You know, there could be various sources, but it's really figuring out how you're going to sustain yourself from a point of bringing in your own capital. And I think that that's when the beauty of a true social enterprise hits, because you're not dependent on the funding. You've got some flexibility. You can, you know, find new ways of doing things or test different levers because you've got the flexibility of being able to fund it yourself. I think that the freedom that comes with actually starting to make your own dollars, you know, come through the door is really when a social enterprise blossoms and can really keep relying on the business side. You've got to keep your operations going. The financial aspect is key, but you've got the freedom then to really focus on the social impact you want to have. So I think that what the, you know, once you're able to, you're for profit and you're actually, you know, earning your keep and bringing dollars through the door, that's then augmenting what is, you know, the core of your business. And in many cases, there's not-for-profits that are you know, working on supplements. Their core funding may still come from government 5 years down the road, but there's always that plan to be self-sustaining and have a larger portion of your finances looked after from for-profit as opposed to government funding.
Good.
Our advisory board, we're a very small organization, as I mentioned, so our advisory board may not be as formal as other organizations. We're also privately funded. So from a governance structure that can sometimes come with not-for-profits and the need for steering committees and advisory boards and whatnot, but we do have one. In typical fashion, we have annual advisory board meetings. But I think, you know, and at those meetings, I should state, we ask for their input, so we'll share our strategic direction for the year and our business plan and ask for their input. But more importantly than those kind of once-a-year meetings, which, by the way, are very hard to arrange. It's very difficult. It sounds easy putting an advisory board together, but get schedules in sync, so you're meeting, and it's difficult. But as important, I think it's really the one-on-one time we spend with the advisory board members. Non-for-profits, it's really important that you give a lot of thought to who's on your advisory board. They bring a lot of credibility to the organization. It's almost like the reputation of those individuals, you know, carries over to your organization, particularly if you're a startup. You know, people's perception of your organization will be very much based on your advisory board. It's one of the first things people Google sometimes when they're looking at not-for-profits. So I think, you know, you can garner a lot of respect by the people that are on your advisory board. But I think the biggest thing as well is just taking advantage of their networks. Not-for-profits need to network on a continual basis. So using your advisory board members and really getting introductions and connections and just that spider web of expanding your reach is probably a key piece of advisory boards.
Great.
Yeah, well, we are incredibly lucky. We're fortunate that we're privately funded, and there's others like us out there, but definitely the majority of not-for-profits would be, you know, their core funding would come from either government or from foundations. So as I said, we're very fortunate. We've had experience in requesting funds from government and foundations because we work, as I said, with so many partners. So, as example, if we've worked on pilots with not-for-profits in the past, we've partnered with them on calls for proposals, requests for proposals, and asked for funding for them and their core operations and how they're going to be working with us. But as I said, we ourselves don't generate funding because we have the benefit of a philanthropist backing our operations.
Great.
Again, we're in a bit of a unique position because we are privately funded, but it doesn't lessen our need to be financially prudent. And I think in some ways, myself and our team feel very accountable because we are using the private funds of an individual. So we want to control our costs and make sure that you know, every dollar we spend or every operational cost we have is being put to good use. You know, and we can directly link it back to input or impact of some sort. So I think it's just as important to us. We don't have to chase the dollars the same way that most not-for-profits do. But I think that not-for-profits, it's a shame actually, because I think they do spend a good deal of their time tracking down, you know, funding sources, and then, you know, gearing their operations and services to the requirements of that funding. So again, it just speaks to the value of social enterprises and other businesses within your not-for-profit so that you can have that financial stability. It's a long road, but it just offers a flexibility and autonomy that, you know, doesn't necessarily come with government funding. I would say it's not that we don't, we may not experience those issues ourselves, but because we work with so many varied partners, we're very cognizant of it. And in being in collaborative partnerships with them, we need to work with them on addressing some of those. So I think I can speak to it. I already touched on it. I think one of the top challenges for a not-for-profit would be just this continual quest for funding. So there's no rest for the weary, you know, from a point of maybe securing, you know, $150,000 from one government ministry, but knowing it's good for this length of time and for these activities, and needing to look for, okay, what's the next step? And I guess maybe in speaking with that, the funding does tend to be short-term and one-off, if that makes sense. So you may have a great pilot or activities that you're looking at, and you've got funding that's available for 12 months, but you don't reach your peak of learning, until the 11th month. And you've found a particular lever or activity that's shown great success, but your funding ends. So you're starting over again. So I think that the fact that it's one-off and short-term are probably two of the biggest challenges that the not-for-profits face. And as well, some of the expectations that come along with the funding. Again, I speak to this quantitative versus qualitative. So I think non-for-profits, what keeps them up at night sometimes is figuring out how to work the system. How do I come up with those numbers? And it's not cheating, it's not lying, it's not misusing government funding. It's taking what you're doing and your passion for having some impact and figuring out how your activity is going to fit within those funding requirements. So it would sure keep me up at night.
That's good.
I think I probably touched on this before, but I think one of the first things when you're looking at it is building into your business plan, how are we going to be self-sustainable? I think it's just not realistic to think that the funding's going to last forever. It isn't. So it's to not allow that fear, scare you from doing what you're doing. But I think it's really just being very cognizant from day one that you've got to figure out how we're going to make this self-sustaining. Over a gradual process as it will be, you still need to be looking at it from day one. I think the other piece is, and I touched on it before, is that value proposition piece. So if you're looking at starting up a social enterprise, you've got your reason for doing that, but you're not going to be able to do it alone. You're going to need to pull in various partners. Some of them will be funders, some of them will be simply supports of one type or another. And it's really looking at developing value propositions for all of those partners, right? You've got your one core mission, but you've got to tweak it so that it resonates and excites other partners that you need to bring into the fold to make it successful. The other side of it is you have to always remember that funding isn't always the requirement from partners. There's all kinds of ways that people can support. It could be pro bono. It could be someone providing consultative services on a pro bono or a free basis. It could be time, could be materials, it could be their network that you can expand from. So I think it's really looking at partners not just from the financial aspect, but the other supports that they could, expertise, knowledge, advice that they can provide as well. I think the other thing too is to work lean, and I know with lean manufacturing and whatnot, we're all getting a bit tired of the lean premise, but people want to blow things right out from the beginning, and I think that there's much to be said about starting small and really using what would be more of a like a developmental evaluation of what you're doing. So let's step back, let's take a look, what worked, what didn't, and then forge ahead. You don't always have to have all the icing on the cake from the beginning. Plain cake works sometimes, right? You start small, you get your feet under you, and look at even your funding requirements that way. More in parcels rather than trying to oversell something that's just too big and people can't grasp it. They don't understand what you're really wanting to do. So I think I'd advise to start small too. I think for me, particularly, I'm director of partnerships, so I love the position. I love engaging with various stakeholders, learning what they do, and figuring out how it fits with what we're doing. I think personally, on a real personal level, I started off in social services. I worked as an employment liaison and a welfare caseworker, and then I went into the private sector for years within recruitment. So for me, it brings real joy to be able to work for not-for-profits and bring all that experience I've had in the private sector but not just be doing it for the gross margin I was going to earn, but doing it in a really socially impactful way. So it brings me great joy to sit down with a not-for-profit and them say, well, how do these staffing agencies work? Or how do we work more like a business? And I can just, share what's been years of experience. And that brings me great joy. I think that being in a position where I can continually learn, the continuous learning competency is something that a lot of employers are looking for, and they want you to bring to the table, but they don't always offer up the opportunity to do that. And I think working for a nonprofit, particularly social capital partners, every day is a learning. So every partnership that I establish, I've got to learn about what they do and how they do it and how it meshes with what we're doing. So to be at this later stage of my career and still feel that I'm learning as much or more than I did in the early parts is pretty phenomenal. So I think aside from that, what brings me joy is knowing that in any small measure, or however small, the impact we may have, everything we do is about really wanting to shift from, taking policy and enforcing practice. Quite often the government says this is how it's going to be done and they roll it out. But being in an organization that values the fact that we need to do the exact opposite and go from practice to policy. So being given the opportunity to test different models, different levers, fail. Sometimes things don't work out. They don't work out as much as they do. But then being able to say, okay, we're going to take this practice and inform policy, as opposed to always being kind of strangled by policy being forced up.